He stood 6'8", a scarred monolith of muscle and lethal power that made the strongest warriors choke on their own breath. When Alpha Eric stepped into the room, an entire bloodline dropped to their knees in terror, all except one, a fragile Omega who simply refused to bow. In the modern world, the lycanthrope community does not hide in the woods. They hide in plain sight. They are the hedge fund managers in Wall Street, the shipping magnates in Seattle, and the political powerhouses in Washington. But beneath the tailored suits and billion-dollar portfolios, the primal laws of the wild still dictate every breath they take, and in the Pacific Northwest, there was only one law: Eric Graves. Eric was not just an alpha. He was an anomaly. Standing at an imposing 6'8", he was a giant of a man with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of a fracturing empire. His face was a harsh landscape of aristocratic angles, ruined by a brutal, jagged scar that slashed down his left cheek, a permanent reminder of the violent coup he led at 19 to rip the Pacific Syndicate from his corrupt uncle's cold, dead hands. For a decade, Eric had ruled the northern packs with an iron fist. He was ruthless, isolated, and entirely terrifying. His sheer presence, the suffocating weight of his alpha aura, was enough to drive grown men to their knees in cold sweats. Every 5 years, the Syndicate held the gathering, a high society masquerade that was, in reality, a primal cattle market. It was an event designed for the Alpha King to select a mate, to secure his bloodline. For 10 years, Eric had rejected every woman presented to him. He found them weak, sycophantic, and utterly terrified of him. Enter Leora Sterling. Leora was a ghost in the system. Born an Omega, the lowest and most vulnerable tier in their society, she was supposed to be docile, submissive, and easily broken. But Leora had grown up in the brutal foster care system of human Portland, completely unaware of her heritage until she shifted at 18. She didn't have the luxury of pack protection. She survived by working graveyard shifts at a miserable diner, taking illegal black market suppressants to hide her scent from the predatory alphas who roamed the city's underbelly. But you cannot hide from the Syndicate forever. A routine blood test at a free clinic flagged her DNA. Within 48 hours, she was thrown into the back of a blacked-out SUV and dragged to the Zenith Hotel in downtown Seattle for the gathering. They shoved her into a cheap, rented silk gown that barely fit, pushing her into a grand ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers and the suffocating scents of expensive perfume and primal fear. There were hundreds of women there, high-born alphas, wealthy betas, and prized omegas, all vying for the crown, yet all visibly shaking at the thought of the monster they were meant to woo. Then the heavy mahogany doors at the top of the grand staircase blew open. The music stopped. The air in the room was instantly sucked out, replaced by a pressure so intense it made the ears ring. Eric Graves stepped into the light. He didn't roar. He didn't even speak. He merely let his alpha aura bleed into the room. It was a physical force, a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated dominance. Leora felt it hit her chest like a sledgehammer. All around her, the sound of tearing silk and gasping breaths echoed as hundreds of women and guards collapsed. High-ranking betas fell to their hands and knees, their faces pressed against the cold marble floor in absolute, involuntary submission. Leora's knees buckled. Her instincts screamed at her to hit the floor, to bare her neck, to submit to the apex predator in the room. But as she looked at the terrified women around her, a different emotion flared in her chest. Not fear. Exhaustion. She was so unbelievably tired of being pushed around, of being afraid of men who used their power to crush the weak. She had survived starvation, the streets, and the human system. She was not going to ruin her rented dress for a man who demanded respect simply because he was born big. Gritting her teeth, Leora fought against her own biology. Her muscles burned, her bones ached, but she forced herself upright. She locked her trembling knees. She threw her shoulders back. In a ballroom of 500 kneeling wolves, Leora Sterling stood entirely alone. From the top of the stairs, Eric paused. His piercing, ice-blue eyes scanned the sea of bowed heads, sweeping over the pathetic display of submission, until his gaze snagged on a tiny, fragile figure in a cheap green dress in the center of the room. The giant alpha went perfectly still. A low, dangerous rumble vibrated in his chest, echoing through the silent ballroom. He began to descend the stairs, his heavy footsteps sounding like a death knell. The crowd parted without standing, crawling out of Eric's path like insects fleeing a forest fire. Leora's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every survival instinct she possessed was screaming at her to run, but she stood her ground, her chin tilted upward, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Eric stopped less than a foot away from her. Up close, he was even more terrifying. He eclipsed the light, casting her entirely in his shadow. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. The scent of him, pine needles, petrichor, and pure ozone, was intoxicating, overwhelming her suppressed omega senses. "Are your legs broken, little wolf?" His voice was a dark, gravelly baritone that vibrated straight through her skin. Leora looked directly into his icy eyes, refusing to break eye contact, a deeply offensive challenge in wolf culture. "No," she said, her voice shaking only slightly, "but the floor looks filthy, and I don't have the money to dry clean this dress." A collective horrified gasp echoed from the kneeling crowd. Her own escort, a beta named Thomas, whimpered from the floor. "She's dead," the room collectively thought. "He is going to tear her throat out." Eric stared at her. For 10 long seconds, the silence was deafening. He analyzed the rapid pulse at her throat, the defiance in her amber eyes, the sheer, impossible willpower it took for an Omega to withstand his direct command. Then, something happened that no one in the Pacific Syndicate had ever witnessed. Eric Graves smiled. It was a small, dangerous smirk that pulled at the scar on his cheek. "What is your name?" he murmured. "Leora." He reached out, his massive hand easily engulfing her jaw. His thumb brushed over her racing pulse point. "You are an Omega, with the spirit of a feral cat, Leora. Pack your things." He stood to his full height and cast a dismissive glare at the rest of the room. "The gathering is over. I found her." The political fallout was immediate and explosive. Within an hour, Leora was strapped into the back of Eric's armored SUV, speeding toward his private estate deep in the Cascade Mountains. The silence in the car was thick. Sitting across from her was Declan Hayes, Eric's beta and chief financial officer. Declan was a sharply dressed, calculating man who looked at Leora like she was a bomb waiting to go off. Next to him sat Chloe Carmichael. Chloe was a stunning, high-born alpha female from the powerful Southern Pax. Her father was a U.S. senator who heavily funded the syndicate's political maneuvers. Everyone had assumed Chloe would be the one Eric chose tonight. It was a strategic alliance that made sense. Instead, he had chosen a nameless street rat. Chloe's eyes burned with a venomous hatred as she stared at Leora. "This is a mistake, Eric," Chloe finally hissed, breaking the silence. "She's an Omega, a feral one at that. She doesn't know our customs, our business. She will make you look weak before the council." Eric didn't even look up from the tablet he was reading in the dim light of the cabin. "The council fears me, Chloe. They will fear whoever stands beside me. If you speak against my mate again, I will have Declan throw you out of this vehicle while it is moving." Chloe snapped her mouth shut, but the murderous glint in her eyes told Leora this was far from over. The Graves estate was a marvel of modern architecture mixed with a high-tech fortress, built directly into the side of a mountain. It had biometric security, armed guards patrolling the perimeter, and glass walls that overlooked the sprawling valleys below. Leora was given a suite larger than any apartment she had ever lived in, but she felt like a bird locked in a gilded cage. That evening, a formal dinner was held in the grand dining room to officially introduce Leora to Eric's inner circle. The tension at the long, polished oak table was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Eric sat at the head, with Leora directly to his right. Chloe and Declan sat opposite them, along with 3 other pack elders who looked at Leora with thinly veiled disgust. "A toast," Chloe announced, standing up gracefully. She raised a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. "To our Alpha. May his reign continue to be unpredictable." A servant stepped forward, placing a freshly poured glass of expensive scotch next to Eric's right hand. As Eric reached for the glass, Leora's breath hitched. Omegas are physically weaker than alphas, but their senses, specifically their sense of smell, are highly evolved, designed to detect sickness and danger in the pack. Beneath the sharp, peaty aroma of the scotch, Leora caught something else. It was faint, almost completely masked by the alcohol, but it was unmistakable. Aconite, wolfsbane, processed, concentrated, and highly lethal. Eric raised the glass to his lips. "Stop!" Leora shrieked. Without thinking, she lunged out of her chair. She didn't just grab his arm. She slapped the heavy crystal glass right out of Eric's massive hand. The glass flew across the table, shattering violently against the stone fireplace. The amber liquid splashed across the Persian rug. Instantly, the fabric began to sizzle and smoke, burning a dark, toxic hole through the expensive wool. The room erupted. The guards at the door drew their weapons. Eric was on his feet in a microsecond, his chair crashing to the floor, his eyes flashing a terrifying, glowing gold as his wolf clawed its way to the surface. He looked from the smoking, acidic puddle on the rug to the trembling Omega standing beside him. The room went dead silent. Chloe's face had drained of all color. Eric slowly turned his massive frame toward Leora. The realization hit him, and everyone else in the room, like a physical blow. The little Omega hadn't just defied him. She had just saved his life, and in doing so, she had proved that the greatest threat to the giant Alpha King wasn't outside his walls. It was sitting right at his dinner table. The shattered crystal on the Persian rug was still smoking when Eric moved. He didn't shout. He didn't demand answers. In a blur of lethal, calculated motion, he crossed the room, grabbed Leora by the waist, and hauled her against his massive chest. "Lock down the estate!" Eric's voice was a terrifying, icy calm that echoed off the stone walls. "No one leaves. If a single soul crosses the perimeter, shoot to kill." He didn't wait for Declan or the bewildered guards to respond. Eric carried Leora out of the dining hall, down a hidden corridor, and straight into the underground garage. He shoved her into the passenger seat of a heavily armored G-Wagon. "Who did it?" Leora gasped, her hand still shaking from the adrenaline. "Eric, half your inner circle was at that table." "Exactly," he growled, ripping the vehicle out of the garage and tearing down the mountain road in the dead of night. "The Pacific Northwest is compromised. The Blackwood and Finch corporate accounts, the politicians, all of it. If they are bold enough to use concentrated wolfsbane in my own dining room, the rot goes deeper than a single traitor." "Where are we going?" "To the only place on this earth where my bloodline is truly untouchable," Eric said, his knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. "The American packs think this is my stronghold. They are fools." Within 3 hours, they bypassed the commercial airports entirely and boarded a black, unmarked Gulfstream jet on a private airstrip. As the plane broke through the clouds, heading north across the globe, the exhaustion finally caught up with Leora. She curled into the leather seat, pulling a small, battered book from her coat pocket. Eric watched her from across the cabin. "What is that?" Leora traced the worn leather cover. "My Bible. I grew up with nothing in the human foster system. No pack, no parents, no protection. When the world felt like it was going to crush me, I found peace in these pages. It taught me that giants can fall, and that justice isn't always swift. But it is absolute." She looked up, her amber eyes meeting his hardened gaze. Proverbs 26:27. "Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. If someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them." Your enemies just dug their own grave, Eric. A profound silence filled the cabin. Eric, a creature forged in violence and primal dominance, felt something strange shift in his chest. Alphas were taught to revere sheer physical power, yet here was an Omega, the supposed weakest of their kind, anchoring him with a quiet, unshakable faith and a wisdom that humbled him. She wasn't relying on fangs or claws. She was relying on a moral absolute. 12 hours later, the jet touched down on a treacherous runway carved out of solid ice. Leora stepped out into an environment so brutal it stole the breath from her lungs. They were in Yakutia, Siberia, the coldest, permanently inhabited region on the planet. The temperature was a staggering -50 degrees. The landscape was a desolate, breathtaking expanse of white tundra and jagged, frozen mountains. Here, hidden deep within the permafrost, was the true ancestral seat of the Graves bloodline. The Siberian stronghold was a brutalist masterpiece of black steel and thermal-heated stone, practically invisible against the dark rock face. For the next week, the Yakutian fortress became their sanctuary. Away from the politics, the masquerades, and the sycophants, Eric and Leora stripped away their titles. Eric taught her how to survive the lethal cold, how to track prey in the deep snow, and how to harness her highly sensitive Omega hearing to detect the subtle shifts in the ice. In return, Leora taught the giant Alpha King how to breathe. She read to him by the massive hearth fires, her soft voice echoing ancient stories of underdog triumphs and divine justice. Eric realized that the Syndicate's obsession with physical dominance had blinded them. Leora's empathy, her sharp mind, and her unyielding spirit were 100 times stronger than Chloe's political pedigree or Declan's financial ruthlessness. But karma and consequence were already tracking them across the globe. Thousands of miles away, Declan Hayes stood in Eric's abandoned Seattle office. On his tablet blinked a small red GPS coordinate, pinging directly from the frozen wastes of Yakutia. Chloe stepped into the office, her high heels clicking sharply. "Are you sure she has it?" I slipped the micro-tracker into the lining of her cheap coat when Thomas brought her to the Zenith Hotel. Declan smirked. "Eric thinks he's playing a grand game of chess, but he's blind." He took the bait. He isolated himself. "The Russian mercenary packs have been paid," Chloe said, a wicked, triumphant gleam in her eyes. "By tomorrow morning the Alpha King will be dead in the snow, and we will take the Syndicate." The attack came at the darkest hour of the endless Siberian night. Leora jolted awake to the blare of klaxons echoing through the stone corridors. The stronghold's thermal generators abruptly cut out, plunging the compound into a freezing, pitch-black darkness. Eric was already on his feet, his eyes glowing a deadly, luminescent gold in the dark. The sound of heavy explosives detonating against the outer steel blast doors shook the very foundation of the mountain. "Mercenaries!" Eric snarled, his voice shifting into the dual-toned rumble of his wolf. "Dozens of them. Declan and Chloe must have tracked us." "Eric, they brought heavy artillery," Leora said, her Omega senses picking up the mechanical clatter of assault rifles and the distinct, acrid scent of silver nitrate rounds. "You can't fight an army alone." "I am the Alpha King of the North," Eric roared, pulling a heavy tactical blade from the wall. "I do not hide. Barricade yourself in the armory, Leora. Do not come out until I come for you." He didn't give her a chance to argue. Eric threw himself down the corridor, meeting the first wave of rogue wolves as the blast doors gave way. The sounds of bone-crushing violence and feral roars echoed through the cold stone. But Leora was done hiding. She had spent her entire life running from predators, and she refused to cower while the man she loved fought her battles. Remembering the scriptures of courage she held so dear, she grabbed a heavy flare gun from an emergency cache and slipped into the ventilation shafts, using her small frame to her advantage. She navigated the tight, freezing metal pathways, her ears twitching as she mapped the battlefield below. Eric was a force of nature, tearing through the mercenaries in the main courtyard, but he was taking heavy fire. Then, Leora caught a scent that made her blood run cold. Expensive perfume mixed with malice. Chloe. Leora dropped from the vent into the thermal control room. Chloe was standing by the mainframe, flanked by two massive rogue alphas, holding a specialized pneumatic rifle loaded with silver-laced wolfsbane darts, the exact same poison from the dinner. She was aiming out the reinforced glass window, directly at Eric's blind spot in the courtyard below. "Looking for a shot, Chloe?" Leora's voice rang out, steady and clear. Chloe whipped around, her eyes narrowing with absolute hatred. "You little street rat. You survived the dinner, but you won't survive this." She gestured to the two alphas. "Tear her to pieces." The men lunged, but Leora wasn't the same terrified girl from the Zenith Hotel. She had learned the environment. As the first alpha lunged, Leora fired the flare gun directly into the room's emergency fire suppression system. The sensors triggered instantly. But instead of water, the Yakutian stronghold was equipped with a liquid nitrogen foam system to prevent electrical fires. A massive, freezing cloud of chemical foam blasted from the ceiling. The sudden drop in temperature blinded the two alphas. They slipped on the rapidly freezing floor, crashing heavily into the steel server racks. Leora darted through the blinding white mist, her Omega agility making her a ghost in the chaos. Chloe shrieked in frustration, swinging her pneumatic rifle blindly. "I'm going to mount your head on my wall. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it." The verse echoed in Leora's mind. Leora ducked under Chloe's wild swing and kicked hard at the back of Chloe's knee. The high-born alpha stumbled backward, losing her balance on the slick, frozen floor. As Chloe fell, her finger tightened on the trigger of the pneumatic rifle. With a sharp hiss, the weapon discharged. The silver-laced wolfsbane dart ricocheted off the reinforced glass window and embedded itself deep into Chloe's own thigh. Chloe gasped, her eyes going wide with terror as the highly concentrated toxin flooded her veins. Within seconds, she collapsed to the floor, completely paralyzed by the very poison she had intended for Eric. Karma had come to collect, swift and absolute. Outside, the tide of the battle turned. Eric, fueled by a relentless, primal fury, decimated the remaining mercenaries. Declan, seeing his army fall and his plan unravel, attempted to flee to the snowmobiles. But the harsh Yakutian environment had no mercy. Blinded by a sudden whiteout blizzard, Declan drove his machine straight into a hidden glacial ravine, swallowed whole by the unforgiving ice of the region. When the sun finally began to rise over the jagged Siberian peaks, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the blood-stained snow, the fighting had ceased. Eric stalked back into the compound, covered in the blood of his enemies, his chest heaving. He found Leora standing over a paralyzed, defeated Chloe. The giant alpha dropped his blade. He walked over to the fragile Omega, dropping to his knees before her, a gesture of ultimate submission that no Alpha King had ever performed. He pressed his bloody forehead against her hands. "You are my anchor," Eric whispered, his voice thick with raw emotion. "You are my Luna. No one will ever doubt your strength again." Leora smiled, running her fingers through his dark hair. The underdog had not just survived the storm, she had commanded it. Through faith, wit, and unyielding courage, Leora had cleansed the syndicate of its rot, proving once and for all that true power doesn't roar, it endures. Justice comes for those who deal in deception, and true power often hides in the most gentle souls. Leora proved that even a fragile Omega can bring an Alpha King's enemies to their knees. If this story of hard karma, survival, and unexpected love kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more thrilling tales